Hello, welcome, hopefully back to this Deuze vlog, a series of interviews and conversations I have with academic friends, people that inspire me, whose readings I assign in my courses, who I cite profusely, and who I love to get to know better, and hopefully you too through these series. And as always, please like, subscribe if you appreciate what you're seeing here. Leave a comment, leave questions. I very much appreciate any feedback and any interaction that you may have, and I hope to continue this series as long as possible. Many good interviews coming up, and today we're going to have a great session because a very dear friend of mine is a guest, Professor Claudia Mellado. And Claudia is a professor at the Pontificia Universidad Catolica de Valparaiso in Chile. And she is well known around the world for her amazing work in shepherding and managing the journalistic role performance project. And this project that is now in its second wave of data collection across 47 countries involving researchers from all over the world, just released its first book-length sort of document of this project and what it's found. The book is called Beyond Journalistic Norms, Role Performance and News in Comparative Perspective. And by all means, please do check that out. It's a phenomenal piece of work. Claudia has lectured as a visiting professor in universities all across Latin America and Europe and beyond. Her work has appeared in all the top journals in our field. She recently guest edited a special issue of Journalism Quarterly about the future of journalism and media research that we'll be talking about in this interview. Um, what we will touch upon this interview is first and foremost, of course, the role performance project. How do you manage a project across 47 countries? And then about the major insights this project has given us. How do we explain the discrepancy between what journalists say they want to do, perhaps what they should do, and between what they actually can do? Which is at the heart of this comparative project, and helping us to have perhaps a bit more respect for the multiple hats that journalists have to wear in order to make it work. The fact that they constantly shift between different role perceptions, that different roles serve different functions in different contexts, that journalism, in other words, it's much more complex and hybrid and perhaps inconsistent as our literature generally makes it out to be. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the ongoing discussion and the all important discussion, not just at the Oscars, but also in the field of journalism and media research and media studies, is to make the field truly inclusive. Not just of the global north and the global south, not just of the east and the west, not just of men and women scholars, not just, but all of that at the same time, deliberately, and not just because we are politically correct or woke or social justice warriors, but because we have so much to learn. So please enjoy this conversation as I did when we recorded it, and I hope to keep seeing you soon. Welcome so much, Claudia. Very good to see you. And
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
so you're right now at home in Santiago, is that correct? Or in Valparaiso?
Yes. No, I'm in Santiago.
Santiago.
Yes.
Well, greetings from the northeast of the UK. And thanks for making the time to sort of chat a little bit about your work and about all the cool stuff that you're doing. And let's just start right there. I mean, hey, your new book is coming out about beyond journalistic norms. I kind of love that title because it feels a bit close to the book that Tamara and I just did, Beyond Journalism. So we're both moving beyond, which is really exciting. I mean, and this project is amazing. I mean, it now involves like 47 countries, researchers from 47 countries. I mean, you're in the second wave. You just had your second wave of data collection, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, how does a project like that come together?
Well, no magical skill at all. But first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. And well, I think that the first thing I can say to you is that this particular project has been the most beautiful exercise of like thinking together that I have done in my life. I feel very fortunate for being working with such a good people. I have the best team. We have had years of collaboration. Right now, they are great scholars. They are super well committed with the study, and I think that the most important part is that we are all seeing this work as a long-term relationship of discovering and doing research. When I would just remember that when we started this project, which was like 2012, it was actually a good idea of very unknown scholars. It actually started as a national endeavor here in Chile. And after a while, it took good shape, and we published some stuff. And it was then when it called the attention of some scholars that wanted to be part of it, and that also encouraged me to make of this global endeavor. But going back to your question on what does it take to keep all these people together? Well, I guess it's a lot of passion and an understanding of cross-national research as a truly collaborative process. And of course, I think it requires a clear understanding that research administration will be part of my life for a long time. But I'm not alone. As I said, I have a great team. We had been, which actually has been consolidated over the years. Several members of our project actually act as advisory committee and help me to take some central decisions. We have also a central administration team from Chile, which is in charge of logistics and general things like, you know, communication, for example, with all our members. And we have also developed better tools to do our research, such as, for example, coding for content analysis through online interfaces, which is very cool because we can see on real time how teams do their work, and we can monitor also data quality. But well, there are so many things that we are trying to improve as well. The first wave that you mentioned, which was between 13 and 18, analyzed role performance in news of print media only in 18 countries. And now we have expanded to study different type of outlets, so television, radio, online, besides print, different ways of analyzing news in terms of including news beats that are outside of macro politics, and also to have a more theoretical sample of countries. But well, just to summarize this question, maybe I could add that one of the things that I actually love the most about this project is its permanent exercise of self-identification with the work that we do. And I think that our new book also shows our collaborative way of working. I mean, if you read it from its first page to the end, you are gonna see that how chapters combine each other in a way that very coherent way, and they dialogue very well, and even it seems to be written by one or two people.
Well, I saw that, right? Most chapters are actually written by a significant section of your team, right? There's a lot of collaborative effort, even in the authorship, let alone in the data collection and so on. So that's a really beautiful statement towards that collaborative spirit that you mentioned. And I mean, look, the project contributes on so many levels to our discussion about what journalism is and what it should be, what it could be, what it can become. And one of the key things is, of course, this link that you make between what journalists want to do and what they're actually doing, right? This has been a conundrum in our field for such a long time, and you show the discrepancies and then take it one step further to show where these discrepancies generally come from. And in the process, you don't eliminate, but you really challenge us to think beyond very simplistic, well, the media in Latin America versus the media in Europe, or the media in Chile versus the media in Canada, or whatever. And you consistently, for the last couple of years, and in this book as well, make this argument for a more hybridized, fluid, dynamic, sort of always on the move kind of understanding of what journalism is or can be in very specific circumstances. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about this move, this passionate, I would indeed, as you say, passionate move towards calling for a hybrid, fluid, dynamic understanding of journalism? Why is this so important, and what are the consequences of such an insight for you?
Yeah, I agree with you that one of the main, well, there's a lot of limitations as well, but one of the main contributions of our project is that it shifts the focus from this idea of professional roles as taken for granted behaviors to that of professional roles as socially constructed, right? Mm-hmm. I truly think that journalists' ideologies are very important. I mean, they legitimize journalism in a particular society, in our society. And we do not argue against that. And I mean, there is really no intention, and we clarify that in our book, in disarticulating normative discourses. What we argue, and I argue as well, is about the risks of relying only on one side of the coin when studying journalistic cultures. Mm-hmm. And that's actually why we invite scholars to think, as you have done as well, to think beyond the normative world, to understand the real validity of different discrete categories that has been normally used to explain our profession. I mean, for me, in all my understanding through these years, analyzing this amazing area of research, roles are quite historical and they depend on specific contexts. I mean, journalists in advanced democracies, for example, they may practice a more detached role at some point in time, while they may perform a much more interventionist role, as is happening these days in the United States. And possibly that's going to change again, and we should continue studying the sources of such variation. I mean, if we want to look into our book, for example, just to tell you some result that we have got from there, we have seen how the data significantly contest previous normative assumptions about this type of journalism that prevails in specific contexts. There is also evidence of significant co-occurrence of professional roles that are used simultaneously by journalists to inform the public. And that means for me that journalists serve purposes that actually go beyond protecting citizens from government's wrongdoing or providing forum for public debate only. They also entertain, they also provide practical advice to the audience sometimes, and more. So it's, well, we could be talking about a lot of several, results that we have found about that, but basically that's how I see this. And even something that has been permanently in research, and in the research of some scholars, autonomy, which could be seen as not that related to it, but it's actually very. I mean, autonomy also doesn't necessarily lead to a more active journalistic voice. that autonomy also is an interesting uh, variable to look at when we analyze, how the normative world doesn't necessarily fit the practice,
Right.
because autonomy doesn't necessarily lead to a more active voice of the journalists. I mean, journalists can also be more interventionist because they are defending specific causes, or because they live in a tradition of high political parallelism, for example.
Right.
So you may ask, of course, why did then journalism scholars only gave importance to study ideals if it was common sense that we were missing several parts of the story?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the answers that I could give you on that is that the field has been very normative in nature. I mean, it has dictate whether journalism can be considered good or bad. And in my personal opinion, that excess of normativism is not helping us at all in our understanding on how journalism continually redefine its rules in different logics and historical times. Norms also evolve.
Right.
News, for example, raise several questions that cannot be answered only by traditional approaches on politics today. Most of the news diet that people are consuming is not actually coming from there. On the other side, social media raises important questions on the role of journalists and their identity.
Yeah.
I wonder, for example, why, and I'm sorry if it's too provocative, but
No,
I would
please.
like to just wonder with you why journalists should follow traditional norms in spaces that are outside of the jurisdiction of institutional journalism. I think we should just look for more answers on that. And as soon as we try to answer those questions, it's clear that what it is and what it should be are different questions, and it will be good to answer both separately.
Right.
Maybe if we are able to do that exercise more frequently, we can be more inclusive. And I think that we could do a wonderful work as scholars if we create more spaces of dialogue between idealizations of our field and real performance.
Claudia, one thing you write in, I think it's the introduction of the new book, you write that journalistic roles are not mutually exclusive in life or in journalism. And I think it's a beautiful statement. And I would love for you to elaborate a little bit more about this. I mean, maybe share an example or two, or how do you see that working, and why this is such a significant statement to make in the context of this global project?
Oh yeah, we shouldn't be so obsessed in trying to label everything in black and white.
Right.
Roles in life are not mutually exclusive, and they have actually never been. As you have documented quite well in your books, for example, multiple functions are a common part of modern culture. So this sort of overlapping of roles that you or me or any journalist may face in life it's an everyday experience. And even though it's quite logic thinking, I think that this position lose steam over the years, and the literature tended to understand roles as poles of continuums and as dependent one each other. But we know that that's not how things work. You, me, or a journalist can indeed believe and perform multiple roles simultaneously, because roles and functions are independent. A journalist may question some officials, at the same time maybe defends specific public policies, or even if the same journalist doesn't feel that holding the power accountable it's super important roles to embrace, it doesn't necessarily imply that he or she will side with those in power. So now, for example, with COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that the journalists have had this capacity of adapting the roles and the practice to very changing circumstances. They work for different outlets, they produce stories from different beats, as you mentioned it before, they write for different audiences all at the same time. So at least it makes sense to think that they are constantly negotiating their ideals with situations that require the combination of specific performances. Sometimes they can be watchdog, other times they can be entertainers, or sometimes they intend to perform a more service functions or everything together. So it could be good to take some distance from perspectives that state that some roles deserve more attention than others. I mean, but what we have found in the practice of journalism around the world through our studies is actually the prevalence of roles that are normally stigmatized by the literature. So at the end, I believe that all roles are relevant for journalism at specific times in specific places.
And that would also have implications for the way we educate journalists, right? It's not for one role or the other, but like, how do you transition meaningfully between roles? How do you remain a sense of ethics while doing so? How do you establish boundaries for yourself and your own sense of professional identity when you are either forced to or want to change roles? How can you, enact a certain role effectively in a situation to get the best kind of information? I mean, these are things that I generally, that I would imagine are quite absent from curricula and from curricular discussions, but based on this work are obviously really important.
Well, all the conversation that we have had today, right, about this, how different norms that deal with these binary functions of journalism are not being reflected in reality, right, and no longer sort of fit the analysis of current media environment. All this, I think we should show to our students. I mean, show them that beside what a norm dictate, facts are not always separate from opinion. I mean, that journalists don't need to be always watchdog, or they don't need to approach their audiences always only as citizens, because the audience also has multiple roles. I mean, that, I don't know, hard news are not always serious, that news are not really locked in these rigid journalistic genders, and etc., etc. I mean, of course, students, journalism students should understand that norms are very necessary for constructing discourses of, let's say, occupational legitimacy. But what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't think about journalism in the abstract. I mean, I'm not saying that we should teach students to abandon their missions, not at all. Or what I'm saying is that we can provide them tools maybe to be able to cope with this task of concealing ideals and practical constraints that they will deal when they go to work.
One thing though, which I thought was really amazing, is that you would sometimes, perhaps you would expect that by comparing journalists from all these different countries and the link between what they say they want to do and what they actually end up being able to do, that you would conclude quite quickly that there's real significant differences between different countries in journalism working in different systems. But actually, one of the most powerful indicators of the differences in the discrepancy between what journalists do and what they say they do isn't necessarily the national context, but it's the media organizational context. If I've understood the different publications on this that you've made on this well, is that sometimes, media ownership and the audience orientation of a media organization can be a much more powerful predictor of that gap than any of the other variables. I mean, how can you sort of elaborate a little bit about that, and what is so important about this concern about understanding the media organizational context within which journalists do their work?
Oh, yeah, of course. I think that's a very important questions today uh, uh, for both for the professional and for scholars studying this field. I mean, we should definitely care more about the level of analysis that we use when we study this link between ideals and practices.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I think it's so important. I mean, rules, of course, can be conceived as individual perceptions of people, you, me, journalists, but rules are socially performed in practice, especially in journalism, as the news is not necessarily produced by just one journalist. So the news is a collective outcome. It's decided by so many people. And even a single story can be product of different reporters, and there will be editors making final decision afterwards, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we say that comparing what journalists want to perceive as reality with what their news organization actually do, it's a more compelling way to analyze the link between norms and performance. And what we have found so far is that the gap between these two big areas, the evaluative part and the performative part, exists in all countries and for all roles, right, which indicate to us that actually journalists are aware of the discrepancies between their ideals and what their news media actually do, and that they maybe use some internal strategies to deal with such discrepancies. Journalists, for example, may disidentify with behaviors that are not quite aligned with their ideals to reduce a sort of emotional dissonance, as we could do as well. They can also sort of normalize the meaning that they give to different constraints, or even they can activate an internal compensatory process, because I mean, as human beings, it's so difficult to remain detached from common practice, you know, for too long. So that's a key thing that we have found. And also what we have found is that public service oriented roles, just, let's say roles closer to a watchdog or civic approach, show definitely the largest gaps across countries.
Right.
Also, and this is quite telling, the importance that journalists give to these two roles, the civic and the watchdog, are not negatively related to performance as we expected, but they are not related at all to practice, which is a key result, because it's an important indication of the real limitations that journalists are facing when they implement their ideals.
I mean, I wonder because one thing that this makes me think of is, for the last couple of years, I've been involved in this project. I think you're familiar with it as well, the New Beats project, coming out of Australia, right? Where we interview journalists who were fired or lost their job in the last couple of years, and to see what happened to them and how they make sense of that often very traumatic experience. And one of the things that really struck me from that project, and also I did it in the Netherlands, surveyed journalists and interviewed a whole bunch of them about this experience, is how they keep on talking about journalism as this beautiful, amazing, noble profession that is the most amazing and the best profession you can have. But then at the same time say, but the industry is shit. The industry is a nightmare. The way media or companies are managed kills journalism. So it's like, it's not journalism that does anything wrong. It's the organization that does something wrong. And it's this interesting, exactly like I said, it's like emotionally dissonant. And you just sit there and I listen to these narratives and I think like, this must produce some kind of conflict, but somehow they keep going. I mean, is that something that you were thinking about as well in finding these discrepancies and looking at the media organizational level for explanations?
Well, we are on that. I mean, that's something that we actually want to go more in depth into this second way. So
All right.
how journalists actually do this sort of this identification and how they activate this compensatory process inside. Because as you said, we also have the impression that journalists can differentiate between journalism and the media as different social institutions, which is true,
Mm-hmm.
but both work together. And in that link, they need to survive to this gap, and they need to do things because they need to work.
Right.
So definitely we should, and that's something pending. That's something that we need to go more into details in this second way.
Exciting. So the book is well, it's not the beginning because you've been at this for such a long time, but it's an ongoing project. It's an amazing project, Claudia, and it just congratulates to you and to the entire team for the work that you've been doing and continue to do. I want to move to a different area where you've been publishing and speaking very passionately about as well in your career, which is the notion of the need, the necessity for our field to be more diverse, more inclusive, to de-westernize, if you will, to include many more voices. This is been an important project for you as well, and shines through in your work. Now, before we talk about that, I want to talk about your own trajectory here. I mean, as far as I can tell, up to about 10 years ago, most, if not all of your publications were in Spanish. And then you sort of slowly but surely started to shift to also publish in English and becoming more and more of a prominent voice in our field. How do you look back on that history? I mean, is that sort of like, is it necessary for us to just all at some point start publishing in English because that's when our voice starts to be counted? Or and how is that process? How was that process for you? I mean, I have a similar thing where I, used to publish in Dutch and then shifted to English. But of course, the Spanish language scholarly community is vast and very rich and has fabulous journals and publishers. So how do you straddle those two worlds?
Yeah, well, I think what prompted me to move from Spanish to English language publications is, I think, that the same reason that prompted you or other non-native English-speaking colleagues. I mean, which is to be able to share ideas with a bigger audience, of course, and to discuss topics more globally. Of course, to conduct comparative studies. I mean, imagine that would be impossible, in other way, and to be part of this more international community. And of course, I think it's much more difficult for non-natives to express our ideas in a different language. I was very good in Spanish at school, but very bad in English. So it was, I mean, a triple effort. But I do think that having non-Western writing in English doesn't necessarily imply to diswesternize the field.
Right.
For me, diswesternize the field implies other things, such as questioning the familiar and opening to this unknown. Doesn't matter the language that you use. And I think that there is so much to do on that. There's this sort of a permanent status quo that we should change. And you asked me about my experience, and I guess that my answer is more related to that. I mean, if I think about it, more of the Latin Americans that stand out at the international community that you also know are the ones that moved to the US or Western countries a long time ago.
Right.
The rest of us, with some exceptions, tend to be invisible in the mainstream context, regardless how good our work is. And if you are different, you are an exception, you are not the rule, which shouldn't be like that. also besides having this marginal representation in the field, we are always in disadvantage. I mean, we don't live in the center of the action, let's say. We don't share the same networks, and we always need to convince to reviewers and editors every time we want to publish our work on why studying a Latin American country or a country from the South Hemisphere is relevant for academic purposes. I, I don't know you, but I cannot imagine asking that question to a Western scholar, a Western European scholar, or to a US researcher, for example. It actually, if it happens that to you as well, it means that we are very screwed. Because I mean, I thought that was just only, the South Hemisphere, but it seems it's just, the dominant, this very dominant, high, like strong position of huge countries, right? I don't know, but in any of the two cases, I think that language, as you were mentioning, it is a barrier, it is an issue. But the main issue is that we are still, and that's something that I truly think that I have seen with my eyes, that is more related to the South Hemisphere than the North,
Right.
is that we are still not accepted as a legitimate author. And we still need to justify our existence in the academic community. And of course, it's true that this idea of more quality in the academic field in terms of scholarly representation from the North and South and etc. has grown exponentially, right? And which is really very positive. It's full of good intentions, but I would like to see how the establishment of that politically correct discourse actually translates into practice. And I haven't seen it yet. And of course, I would like to see more proactivity from the part of other non-Western colleagues as well.
Right. Now, one significant intervention that you've made, I mean, beyond your talks and your publications on this, is you recently guest edited together with Mira Georgiou and Senggang Na, a special issue of Journalism Quarterly, arguably one of the most traditional journals in the field of journalism studies. Sort of calling for people to contribute to debates about, where our discipline is going and what is possible in that space, and that special issue is also very much benchmarked by your introduction and introductory remarks about this particular discussion in the context of globalization and digitization, that together you argue make for sort of an ongoing destabilization. They produce a kind of energy in our field, both on the level of theory, of research methods, of the way we publish and express ourselves about our research, how we make sense of things that we do. That is sort of a destabilizing agent. And I don't know, but when I was reading your introduction and the various contributions to the special issue, instead of worry and concern and like, ooh, where is this going? It felt strangely optimistic and kind of like, well, this is going to be fun. So I thought it was really an interesting vibe, if you will. Is that exactly how you see it, and how did you feel about that particular work?
Yeah, well, we are on the same page, because that was exactly what we were trying to transmit. I mean, you participated in that issue as well. That was
thanks so much. That was a lot of fun.
Amazing issue and amazing work what you and all the others contribute. And actually, that issue, it defends, of course, in its own way, a similar idea of what we defend in our book from the GRP project, which is that established analytical frameworks in journalism and in media studies cannot be taken for granted anymore. That science is, of course, always and always will be a work in progress, thanks God. I mean, that also so many things to improve and to discover, and that there are no permanent answers. For example, I'm very obsessed in a way with modeling time in journalism. I'm trying to see how this work, which, by the way, I mean, time is one of the most important variables to explain the world. But for the case of journalism, it's quite difficult to model it because things change so fast. I mean, how many years scholar has been studying journalism? Like 100 years? So,
Right.
I mean, that's clear not enough to explain variations in such a dynamic area of research. So as you, I believe that we shouldn't be so afraid of not finding all the answers. I mean, of course, we need to critically address what happened in the field, posing relevant and inclusive questions, but we should be open to reimagine how things may be. And we should stop using these binary classifications, and not only in journalism as a profession, but also even on how we classify our own work as scholars. I mean, we're supposed to be the soft part of science, but I haven't seen anything harder than trying to explain human behavior. And that's exactly what we do from a social field like this one. So, I mean, we work in the hardest part of the science. That will be my say.
That I think that's a perfect sentiment. Like, yeah, this is the hardest job there is, and it's just getting more complicated, right? As the world moves into each other, both physically as well as virtually, exactly what we're doing now. As debates about representation become more and more acute, whether it's in the film industry, the Oscars right now, or in our field, with prominent journals dedicating special issues to these debates. So yeah, it's a really interesting time, and I'm just so excited that what clearly comes out of this incredible project that you're running is, if anything, this sort of need to be more aware of all the different ways that journalism can be seen and can be done, right? That it's not just, a manifesto or a theory, which Barbie Zelizer produced, which is amazing. And she calls for the kind of research that you actually now have produced, which I think is just a beautiful, team effort, I would say. So thanks again for that, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk. This is really great.
Thank you. I was it was super fun. Thank you for inviting me to these sessions, which, by the way, are quite cool. I think it's very good for scholars, for students to hear each other in a different, atmosphere as well.
Well, if we can't have you in our classroom as a live human being, at least this is one way for everyone to get to know you just a little bit better, and that's been a privilege. So thanks again, and I'll hope we see each other very soon.